My son came home from school with bruises and said, "The teacher locks us in the closet when we're bad." When the principal investigated, they found restraint marks on 6 other children. I noticed the bruises on Lucas's wrists while he was eating dinner. Dark purple rings circling both arms, the kind that come from someone gripping too hard. My son was 7 years old, and those marks looked fresh. I set down my fork and asked him what happened. He kept his eyes on his plate and said nothing. I asked again, softer this time, and he finally looked up at me with tears building in his eyes. "Mrs. Brennan locks us in the closet when we're bad. She says if we tell anyone, she'll make it worse." His voice was so small I barely heard him. My ex-wife Rachel had moved out 6 months ago, leaving me to navigate single parenthood while working full-time as an electrician. I was doing my best, but moments like this made me feel like I was failing. I pulled Lucas onto my lap and examined the bruises more carefully. They were consistent with someone grabbing his wrists and dragging him. I asked how long this had been happening, and he said since the school year started in September. It was now late October. 6 weeks of my son being abused, and I hadn't noticed. Lucas told me Mrs. Brennan had a supply closet in the back of her second-grade classroom. When kids talked too much or didn't finish their work or broke any of her rules, she'd grab them by the wrists and drag them to the closet. She'd lock them inside for hours sometimes, missing lunch and recess. The closet was dark and small and smelled bad. Kids cried in there, but no one could hear them because of the thick door. Lucas said he'd been in there 4 times, once for talking during silent reading, once for not showing his work on a math problem, once for asking to use the bathroom, once for defending another kid who was being yelled at. Each time, Mrs. Brennan had gripped his wrists so hard they bruised. She'd tell the kids it was their fault, that they made her do this, that good children didn't need punishment. Lucas said other kids got locked in the closet too. He named 5 classmates. I felt rage building in my chest, the kind that made my hands shake. I forced myself to stay calm for Lucas's sake. I told him he was brave for telling me, and that this was not his fault, that what Mrs. Brennan was doing was wrong and I was going to fix it. That night after Lucas went to bed, I photographed his bruises from every angle, documented everything he'd told me in a notebook with dates and details. I wanted evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I barely slept, lying awake planning what I'd say to the principal, to the school board, to the police if necessary. At 6 in the morning, I was already dressed and making Lucas breakfast. He came downstairs looking anxious and asked if he had to go to school. I told him yes, but that I was coming with him and we were going to talk to Principal Davison together. Lucas's face went pale. He said Mrs. Brennan would know he told and she'd be mad. I promised him I wouldn't let her hurt him again, that I'd protect him no matter what. We drove to Pinewood Elementary in silence. Lucas kept picking at his fingernails, a nervous habit he'd developed since Rachel left. The school was a single-story brick building that looked friendly enough from the outside. Inside, the hallways were decorated with student artwork and motivational posters. Everything looked normal, safe, but I knew better now. Principal Davison's office was at the front of the building. Her secretary said she didn't take walk-ins, and I'd need to schedule an appointment. I said this was an emergency regarding my son's safety and I wasn't leaving until she saw us. The secretary's expression changed from annoyed to concerned. She went into the principal's office and came back a moment later, saying Principal Davison would see us immediately. The principal was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She had the kind of face that suggested she'd spent years dealing with difficult parents and wasn't easily rattled. She invited us to sit and asked what this was about. I pulled up my sleeve and showed her the photos on my phone of Lucas's wrists. Then I had Lucas show her the actual bruises. Principal Davison's face went rigid. She asked Lucas directly what happened. He repeated what he'd told me the night before, his voice shaking but clear. Mrs. Brennan locked kids in the closet. She grabbed them hard enough to leave marks. It had been happening since school started. Principal Davison called her secretary and told her to pull Lucas's classmates, the 5 names he'd mentioned, out of class for private interviews. She called the school counselor and the vice principal into the office. Then she called someone I assumed was the district superintendent based on how formal her tone became. She explained the situation and said she was initiating an immediate investigation. After she hung up, she looked at me and said she was taking this seriously, that if Lucas's allegations were true, there would be consequences. She asked if I'd filed a police report yet. I said no, I'd come to the school first, because I wanted them to handle it internally before involving law enforcement. She said that was probably wise for now, but that if the investigation confirmed abuse, she'd be legally required to report it to Child Protective Services and the police. She thanked me for bringing this to her attention and said most parents would have gone straight to social media or the news. I told her I wanted justice, not publicity. I wanted Mrs. Brennan held accountable, and I wanted to make sure this never happened to another child. Principal Davison had Lucas wait in the counselor's office while she interviewed the other children. I sat in the hallway outside her office for 3 hours while she talked to one kid after another. I could hear muffled voices through the door, but couldn't make out words. Around noon, the vice principal came out and told me they'd found enough evidence to remove Mrs. Brennan from the classroom, effective immediately. They'd placed her on administrative leave pending a full investigation. He said I should take Lucas home for the rest of the day, and that someone from the district would contact me within 24 hours. I asked what they'd found, and he said he couldn't discuss details of an ongoing investigation, but that multiple children had confirmed Lucas's account. Multiple children had similar bruising. Multiple children described being locked in the closet. The pattern was undeniable. I felt vindicated and furious at the same time. Vindicated because Lucas had been telling the truth, and people were finally listening. Furious because this meant 6 or 7 kids had been suffering, and no one had noticed until now. I picked up Lucas from the counselor's office and we drove home. He was quiet during the drive, staring out the window. When we got inside, he asked if Mrs. Brennan was going to get in trouble. I said yes, she was going to get in serious trouble for what she did. He asked if she'd go to jail. I said I didn't know, but that she definitely wouldn't be teaching anymore. Lucas nodded and then asked if the other kids were okay. I told him the school was talking to all of them and their parents, making sure everyone was safe. Lucas said he felt bad for telling because now everyone would know, and maybe the other kids would be mad at him. I knelt down so I was at his eye level and told him he'd done the right thing. That keeping silent would have let Mrs. Brennan keep hurting people. That speaking up was brave and important. He hugged me, and I held him, feeling the weight of how close I'd come to missing this entirely. If I hadn't noticed the bruises, if he hadn't trusted me enough to tell, if I'd brushed it off as kids being rough at recess, any of those things could have let this continue. That afternoon, I got a call from a detective with the county sheriff's office. His name was Isaiah Grant, and he said Principal Davison had reported the allegations as required by law. He needed to interview Lucas and me as part of a criminal investigation into child abuse. He came to our house that evening with a female detective named Yolanda Cruz, who specialized in crimes against children. They were professional but gentle with Lucas, asking him to describe what happened in his own words. Lucas told them everything again. Detective Cruz took photos of his bruises and collected the photos I'd taken the night before. Detective Grant asked if Mrs. Brennan had ever hit Lucas or touched him inappropriately. Lucas said no, just grabbed his wrists and locked him in the closet. The detective said that was still assault and unlawful restraint of a minor, that Mrs. Brennan could face serious criminal charges if the investigation confirmed what Lucas described. He said they'd be interviewing all the children from that classroom over the next few days, building a comprehensive case. The next morning, I got a call from another parent, a woman named Angela Whitmore, whose daughter Ivy was in Lucas's class. She'd gotten my number from the school directory and wanted to compare notes. She said Ivy had come home with bruises too, had described being locked in the closet multiple times, had been having nightmares for weeks. Angela was furious that this had been happening and no one had caught it sooner. She asked if I wanted to coordinate legal action, and I said yes. We agreed to meet that afternoon at a coffee shop near the school. When I arrived, there were already 4 other parents there. All of them had children in Mrs. Brennan's class. All of them had discovered bruises, heard stories about the closet, realized their kids had been abused. We shared information and compared timelines. The pattern was clear. Mrs. Brennan had been systematically abusing her students since the first week of school. Some kids more than others, but all of them had experienced or witnessed her violence. One father named David Knox said his son had wet himself in the closet because Mrs. Brennan wouldn't let him out to use the bathroom. His son was so ashamed, he'd tried to hide it, stuffing his soiled clothes in the back of his closet at home. Angela suggested we hire a lawyer to file a civil suit against the school district for negligence. She said the district should have known this was happening, should have had oversight systems in place to catch abusive teachers. David agreed and said he knew an attorney who specialized in educational malpractice. I said I was more interested in seeing Mrs. Brennan face criminal charges than in getting money from a lawsuit. Another parent, a woman named Keisha Porter, said we could do both, that civil and criminal cases could proceed simultaneously, that maybe a large enough settlement would force the district to implement better safeguards. We agreed to pool our resources and hire the attorney David knew. His name was Malcolm Reeves, and he had a reputation for taking on institutional abuse cases. Malcolm met with all 6 families over the next week. He reviewed the evidence, interviewed our children, and filed a comprehensive lawsuit against the school district, alleging systematic failure to protect students from a known abusive teacher. The lawsuit claimed the district had received complaints about Mrs. Brennan's methods in previous years, but had failed to investigate thoroughly. That detail shocked me. Previous complaints meant this wasn't the first time, meant other kids had suffered, and nothing had been done. Malcolm showed us the complaint history he'd obtained through public records requests. In the previous 3 years, 5 parents had complained about Mrs. Brennan's harsh discipline methods. 2 complained she yelled too much. 1 said she'd grabbed a child roughly. 1 said she'd denied bathroom breaks as punishment. 1 said she'd locked a child in the closet. That last complaint had been filed 2 years ago by a parent whose child was now in 4th grade. The district had investigated, interviewed Mrs. Brennan, accepted her explanation that the child was confused and had been temporarily isolated in a reading corner, not locked in a closet. The complaint had been dismissed as unfounded. Malcolm said that dismissal was negligence, that the district had enough information to warrant serious scrutiny but had chosen to believe the teacher over the child. That decision had enabled 2 more years of abuse. The parents in previous years had apparently dropped the issue after the district dismissed their complaints. They'd moved their kids to different schools or different teachers and moved on. They hadn't known other kids were still suffering. The criminal investigation moved forward alongside the civil case. Detective Grant interviewed every child in Mrs. Brennan's current class and several from previous years whose parents came forward after news of the investigation spread. By the end of November, he'd documented abuse against 14 children total over 3 school years. The district attorney's office filed charges: 7 counts of child abuse, 14 counts of unlawful restraint, multiple counts of assault. Mrs. Brennan was arrested at her home and held on bail. Her lawyer immediately began building a defense, claiming she'd used approved discipline techniques and that the children were exaggerating or lying. The lawyer argued that isolation was a legitimate classroom management tool and that Mrs. Brennan had never intended to harm anyone. The bruises, according to the defense, were from normal childhood activities and parents were connecting dots that didn't connect. The claim was insulting and transparent. 14 children with identical stories about being locked in a closet, many with documented bruising, wasn't coincidence. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early December. I took time off work to attend. The courtroom was packed with parents, teachers, reporters, and community members. Mrs. Brennan sat at the defense table in a conservative dress, looking like a kindly grandmother rather than someone accused of systematic child abuse. Her lawyer presented her as a dedicated educator who'd spent 30 years shaping young minds, who'd received teaching awards, who'd volunteered for school committees. He implied the allegations were part of a witch hunt driven by overprotective parents who didn't understand modern discipline challenges. Then the prosecution called Lucas to testify. Watching my 7-year-old son walk to the witness stand was one of the hardest moments of my life. He looked so small sitting in that chair, his feet not touching the ground. The prosecutor was gentle, asking him to describe what happened in Mrs. Brennan's classroom. Lucas's voice was quiet, but steady. He described being grabbed by the wrists, being dragged to the closet, being locked inside in the dark for hours. He showed the judge his wrists where the bruises had faded to yellow-green but were still visible. The defense attorney cross-examined Lucas, trying to poke holes in his story. He asked if Lucas was sure it was Mrs. Brennan who grabbed him or could it have been another student roughhousing. Lucas said no, it was definitely Mrs. Brennan. The attorney asked if the closet door had actually been locked or just closed. Lucas said locked. He'd tried the handle from inside. The attorney asked if Lucas had told his parents immediately when this first happened. Lucas said no, because Mrs. Brennan said he'd get in worse trouble if he told. The attorney tried to frame that as suspicious, suggesting Lucas had fabricated the story later. The prosecutor objected, and the judge sustained it, saying the attorney was badgering a child witness. After Lucas testified, 5 other children took the stand with similar accounts. By the end of the hearing, the judge ruled there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Mrs. Brennan remained free on bail but was prohibited from contact with any of the victims or their families. The trial date was set for March, 4 months away. Those 4 months felt interminable. Lucas started therapy to process the trauma. He had nightmares about being locked in dark spaces. He became clingy, not wanting to leave my side. School became a source of anxiety even though he'd been moved to a different teacher's classroom. The new teacher, Mrs. Kowalski, was warm and patient. She worked hard to rebuild Lucas's trust in educators. But the damage was done. Lucas flinched when teachers raised their voices. He had panic attacks if a door closed unexpectedly. The therapist said these were normal trauma responses that would improve with time and treatment. But watching my son suffer broke my heart. Rachel, my ex-wife, called when she heard about the case. She'd moved 3 hours away after the divorce and had weekend visitation with Lucas. She said she'd noticed he seemed more anxious lately, but had attributed it to the divorce adjustment. I told her everything and she was devastated. She blamed herself for not being more present, for not noticing the signs. I told her this wasn't her fault or mine. This was Mrs. Brennan's fault. This was the school district's fault for not responding to previous complaints. We couldn't have known what we didn't know. Rachel asked if she should come back, be more involved in the legal proceedings. I said Lucas would benefit from both parents being united and present. She started making the drive more frequently, attending therapy sessions, coordinating with me on Lucas's care. The crisis had brought us together as co-parents in a way the marriage never had. The civil lawsuit moved forward faster than the criminal case. Malcolm Reeves was relentless in discovery, demanding documents and depositions from every school administrator who'd been involved in handling previous complaints about Mrs. Brennan. The district's lawyers tried to fight the release of personnel files, claiming privacy protections. The judge overruled them, saying public interest in understanding how a teacher had been allowed to abuse children for years outweighed privacy concerns. The documents that emerged were damning. Not only had the district received 5 complaints over 3 years, but Mrs. Brennan's performance reviews had included notes about her strict disciplinary approach and concerns from teaching assistants about her methods. A teaching assistant from 2 years ago had reported seeing Mrs. Brennan lock a child in the supply closet for 30 minutes. The principal at the time had investigated by asking Mrs. Brennan about it, accepting her denial, and filing the complaint as unsubstantiated. The teaching assistant had quit shortly after, citing a hostile work environment. Malcolm tracked her down and took her deposition. Her testimony was explosive. She described multiple incidents of Mrs. Brennan using physical force with students, isolating them in the closet, denying them lunch or recess as punishment. The teaching assistant, whose name was Rhonda Sullivan, said she'd reported these incidents to the principal multiple times. Each time, the principal had told her that Mrs. Brennan was a veteran teacher who knew what she was doing, that classroom management sometimes looked harsh to outsiders, that Rhonda should focus on supporting Mrs. Brennan rather than undermining her. When Rhonda had persisted, suggesting they should at least document the incidents, the principal had transferred her to a different classroom. A month later, Rhonda had found her contract wouldn't be renewed for the following year. She'd been effectively pushed out for trying to protect children. Malcolm asked why she hadn't gone to the school board or the police. Rhonda said she'd been a young teacher afraid of losing her career. She'd assumed the principal knew better than she did. She'd convinced herself maybe she was overreacting. Now, seeing the extent of the abuse, she was consumed with guilt. She'd failed those kids by staying silent. Malcolm told her she wasn't responsible for the district's failures, but her testimony would help hold them accountable now. Rhonda agreed to testify at both the civil and criminal trials. The school district's response to the lawsuit was to offer a settlement. They proposed paying each family $100,000 in exchange for dropping the case and signing non-disclosure agreements. Malcolm advised against accepting. He said the case was worth significantly more, given the extent of the abuse and the district's negligence. More importantly, he said accepting money with an NDA would prevent us from speaking publicly about what happened, would let the district sweep this under the rug. I agreed with Malcolm. This wasn't about money. This was about forcing systemic change and making sure what happened to our kids never happened to anyone else. All 6 families declined the settlement offer. The district came back with a higher offer, $250,000 per family, plus an agreement to implement new oversight procedures for disciplinary practices. Malcolm said the oversight procedures were vague and unenforceable as written. He countered with a demand for $500,000 per family, plus specific, binding reforms, including mandatory cameras in all classrooms, regular independent reviews of discipline reports, and a zero-tolerance policy for physical contact or isolation punishments. The district rejected our counteroffer, and we proceeded toward trial. The criminal trial began in March, as scheduled. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They called 14 child victims, who described being locked in the closet, being grabbed hard enough to bruise, being denied food and bathroom access. They presented medical evidence of bruising and psychological trauma. They called Rhonda Sullivan, who testified about what she'd witnessed and reported. They called the parents who'd complained in previous years and been dismissed. They presented the complaint records, showing the district had been warned. The defense's strategy was to portray Mrs. Brennan as a dedicated teacher, overwhelmed by difficult students in an underfunded school system. Her lawyer called character witnesses, former students who said she'd been strict but fair, administrators who praised her commitment. The defense argued that classroom isolation was standard practice, that the closet was used only for brief cool-down periods, that any bruising was accidental or from other sources. Mrs. Brennan herself testified, crying on the stand, saying she'd never meant to hurt anyone, that she loved children, that teaching was her calling, that these accusations had destroyed her reputation and her life. The prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They showed photos of the closet. It was a narrow space, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet, with no windows, no light, no ventilation. The door locked from the outside. It wasn't a calming corner or a cooling-off space. It was a cell. They showed the pattern of complaints and the district's pattern of dismissals. They presented expert testimony from child psychologists about the long-term trauma caused by isolation and physical restraint. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they came back, the verdict was guilty on all counts. Mrs. Brennan showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. At sentencing, the judge noted the severity and duration of the abuse, the number of victims, the betrayal of trust inherent in a teacher harming students. He sentenced Mrs. Brennan to 12 years in prison. She'd serve at least 8 before being eligible for parole. As they led her out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she finally looked at me and the other parents. Her expression wasn't remorseful, it was angry. She felt wronged. Even after everything, she believed she'd done nothing deserving punishment. The civil trial followed 3 months later. The criminal conviction made the civil case much stronger. We weren't trying to prove abuse happened. That was established fact. We were proving the school district had been negligent in preventing and responding to it. Malcolm presented the complaint history, the ignored warnings, the intimidation of Rhonda Sullivan. He showed how the district had prioritized protecting a teacher over protecting children. He presented district policies that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of abuse, but had never been enforced. The district's defense was that they'd followed all required procedures, that they'd investigated complaints when received, that they couldn't have known Mrs. Brennan would escalate. Malcolm demolished that argument. The procedures had been inadequate and inconsistently applied. The investigations had been superficial, accepting teacher denials without interviewing children or examining evidence. The district had known based on multiple warnings and had chosen institutional protection over child safety. The jury agreed. They awarded each of the 6 families $750,000 in compensatory damages. Then they added punitive damages of $5 million to be split among all families, sending a message that this level of institutional failure was unacceptable. The financial impact on the school district was significant enough to force changes. The district fired the principal who'd dismissed previous complaints. They fired 2 assistant superintendents who'd been involved in handling personnel issues. They implemented the reforms Malcolm had demanded: cameras in all elementary classrooms, independent quarterly reviews of discipline reports, mandatory reporting systems that bypassed principals for serious allegations. They created a parent advisory board with real authority to investigate concerns. The settlement money allowed all of our families to afford therapy, tutoring, and whatever else our children needed to recover. Lucas continued therapy for 2 years. Slowly, his nightmares decreased. His anxiety diminished. He learned to trust teachers again, though he remained more cautious than he'd been before. He made friends, did well academically, grew into a resilient kid who'd survived something terrible. By the time he was 10, he rarely talked about Mrs. Brennan. By 12, he told me he wanted to become a teacher himself someday, the kind who made kids feel safe. That's when I knew he'd be okay. 5 years after the trial, I attended a school board meeting where they were voting on whether to name the reforms after the children who'd been harmed. The Pinewood Protection Protocols would ensure no child at any school in the district would suffer what Lucas and his classmates had suffered. The vote was unanimous. Lucas was 12 now, sitting next to me, and when the board president announced the vote result, he squeezed my hand. We'd turned his trauma into something that would protect thousands of other children. That was justice. Not perfect, not complete, but real. Mrs. Brennan was in prison. The district had been held accountable. Systems had changed, and my son had not just survived, but learned he had the power to create change by speaking truth. That night, driving home, Lucas asked if I thought Mrs. Brennan ever felt sorry for what she did. I said honestly, I didn't know. Some people never accept responsibility for their actions, but what mattered wasn't her remorse. What mattered was that she couldn't hurt anyone else, that the system that enabled her had been dismantled, that he and the other kids had been believed and protected. Lucas nodded and looked out the window at the streetlights passing by. Then he said something that made my eyes burn with pride. I'm glad I told you, even though it was scary, because now other kids are safe. I reached over and ruffled his hair. Me too, buddy. Me too. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.